Hello, welcome back again to Music Between the Numbers. My name is Andy Jaski, and this is the 5th episode and the final one for the near term, where we take a look at quantitative measures of how popular music has changed over time. In this episode, I'll look at the duration of songs. I'll follow that up by looking at several artists' albums and see how those compare to some of our metrics over time. And then finally, we'll do a summary of all 12 metrics that we've looked at over the last 5 episodes. So it should be an interesting way to wrap things up. So let's go to the PowerPoint and get started. In other episodes, I've gone over the prior metrics near the beginning, but this week I want to save that until the end in order to summarize what we've learned. Our final metric, which is duration, is actually quite an interesting one as it has a distinctive pattern and characteristics, and it might actually surprise you a little. As a reminder, we're looking at a database of 660 songs that were Billboard Top 10 for each year from 1955, the first year of rock and roll, through the year 2020. Let's start with our top 10 and bottom 10 analysis, with the top 10 representing the 10 longest songs and the bottom 10 the 10 shortest songs on the list. And if you've watched the previous weeks, you'll be happy to know that Hollaback Girl doesn't make either list. So the number is in seconds, but American Pie clocks in at 516 seconds, or 8 minutes and 36 seconds. We see that by the time we get to the 10th song on the list, we're actually under 6 minutes. Of course, almost all of these songs had radio versions that were closer to 3 minutes, but the songs themselves were of this length. The only song after 1991 that is on the list is Mirrors by Justin Timberlake. So for all of our other metrics, we have seen that if older music dominates the top 10, then newer music tends to dominate the bottom 10, and vice versa. But on duration, it's something different. In fact, the bottom 10 is really old music with only one song on the list from after 1963. So back in the late 1950s and early 60s, almost every song was really short, with the shortest top 10 song being 1 minute and 50 seconds long. I'm going to use both the summary by decade and the one we did previously too, of cutting this by 10-year periods starting in the 5-year, or the cultural decade, as that provides some additional insight. We'll also check the last couple of years as well. The actual decade and the cultural decade tell a similar story, but the first shows the really short length of songs in the 1964 and prior period. Then we have increasing length through the 1990s, the mid-90s in particular, and then it starts to fall off, but interestingly enough, it falls off back to 1970s music length rather than all the way back to the 1950s length. If we look at the last 6 years, things continue to drop, and isolating 2019 and 2020, the average length falls to 196 seconds, or 3 minutes and 16 seconds. So that's our summary on the duration metric. Now let's look at a broader array of Spotify metrics for some albums. So let's pick a few albums over time and see how the Spotify metrics compare to those of different periods. From current times, I'm going with Taylor Swift's album Fearless and The Weeknd's After Hours. From a middle period, I'm going with Madonna's Like a Virgin album. And from older music, let's go with the Beatles' Rubber Soul album. And I'll throw in my latest album just to see if it really is new music for old souls, as I named it, or where my own music fits on the continuum. If you're an artist on Spotify, you should try this yourself or pay me an exorbitant fee to do it for you, or maybe a small fee. There is nothing particularly scientific about these choices, and we could do this for lots of albums and even music in particular genres, and maybe we will in the future. If there are further episodes of Music Between the Numbers, we'll likely extend the analysis to more hits and extend it to characterize metrics of different genres of music. So let's look at our metrics and split them into 3 periods. 1955 to 1969 are the first 15 years. 2006 to 2020 are the last 15 years. And 1970 to 2005, which is everything in between. So we'll call the oldest period Old School, and the newest 15 years New School, and then I guess the rest are Middle School, or something like that. While there are interesting trends up and down on things like chord count and duration, there are 6 metrics that have distinct differences between Old School and New School, with the middle period ranking in the middle. Those 6 metrics are danceability, energy, loudness, acousticness, speechiness, and valence, or mood. So let's look at each of these in turn and see how the values differ from Old School to New School and for the 5 albums we are examining. In the charts, I've put New School on the left, and then the artists in the order I would expect them to show up as New School to that side, and then Old School to the right, and then the artist I would expect to show up as Old School toward that side. Our first one is a bit of a stunner. Danceability is actually highest for Madonna's album, and, well, my album. Well, Madonna makes sense for sure, and apparently Just So Happy on my album pulls up the average. It's odd that The Weeknd is not more New School. In fact, he appears Old School here. But checking the 2 most popular tracks on his album, they are both above average on danceability, and one scores fairly high. And he has a couple of tracks that bring his average down a bit. Similarly, Taylor Swift's most popular tracks are higher than average danceability. On energy, the variation tends to be fairly small, as most of the music here trends toward the New School metrics. On this one especially, the most popular tracks from the Taylor Swift and The Weeknd albums are very high. The Beatles album is more Old School here, with songs like Michelle and In My Life on the album. Now, loudness shows Madonna to have the quietest album, followed by the Beatles. This outcome makes me think this measure really isn't looking at how loud songs are played, but really is just a function of changes in the ability to mix and master music at higher volumes today due to changes in technology. Speechiness finally starts to give us more of a pattern that could be expected. Although even here, The Weeknd doesn't show up as high as one might think, but he's an artist with a great voice who does a lot of singing. The pattern makes a bit more sense with him a bit higher and everyone else lower. In fact, the albums here are past the Old School cutoff with the exception of the one by The Weeknd. Acousticness finally starts to give us the pattern we might expect, and here is where my album is definitely over in the Old School camp. The Beatles measure just seems odd to me, as there are several very acoustic songs on Rubber Soul. It strikes me odd that Norwegian Wood has a relatively low value on this. There's a wide variation on that album. I think, like quite a few of the Spotify measures in aggregate, they tend to make a lot of sense, but sometimes on individual tracks they seem a bit off. I actually would call into question their measure of acousticness for the Rubber Soul album. Finally, let's look at valence. Okay, here we really see the split between new and old, so maybe this measure is capturing something important. I'm just not sure it's precisely mood, but based on the Spotify definition, the Weeknd album leans toward some combination of sad, angry, and depressed, as well as Taylor Swift's album to a lesser extent, while Madonna, the Beatles, and myself are all pretty chipper. So again, I put my own music in here as an example for artists on Spotify to think about their own songs. I was correct in assessing my music as more Old School on speechiness, acousticness, and valence. However, it's not quite so Old School on danceability and energy. On loudness, It's new school, but that I think is really just a function of today's technology and nothing else. Another thing that we may see in these comparisons is that the music on albums of some top artists today may be somewhat different than their hits, at least in terms of danceability and energy, suggesting it might be a bit more on the marketing and the public in terms of the direction top 10 music has headed than the artists themselves. Popular music may have a different purpose nowadays, more as a dance and entertainment theme, more so than in the past where there was more of a listening theme. So we've learned a lot about popular music and how it has changed in measurable ways over the 5 episodes of Music Between the Numbers. Let me try to summarize that now. Remember this guy? Yeah, that's Rick Beato, musician, producer, music teacher, and YouTube star extraordinaire who posed the question as to why boomers hate pop music and then proceeded to answer it, and answered it pretty well from a musician's perspective. Part of what I've undertaken here is to try to quantify or make measurable some of his insights and see if we could establish via data that music has changed distinctively and how it has changed. And what we've seen is that of 12 metrics that we examined, at least 9 of them have shown some variation through time. Let's review them in the order we introduced them. The first is chord count, or number of chords per song, which went up through the 70s and then was fairly stable for a while, but dropped dramatically after the millennium to a low in the most recent decade. Danceability and energy have generally increased through time. Danceability has generally trended up, with the biggest jumps from the 60s to the 70s, the 70s to the 80s, and the 90s to the post-millennium period. Energy has generally trended up as well, although the 1990s were lower as there were a large number of ballads in that decade that reached the top 10. Loudness has increased over time, but it's probably more of a function of changes in recording technology than it is a real change to music. Speechiness also has had a solid upward trend, which is not surprising given the more pervasive existence of rap and hip-hop, and even autotune probably impacts this metric. The acousticness of music has declined over time and done so fairly dramatically, with a steep drop from the 1950s to the 1980s. Liveness has not changed, as almost all top pop music is recorded in a studio, and live recordings are usually only released after the song is a hit. Instrumentals have gone down in terms of hitting the top of the charts. While they never dominated the charts, there was the occasional instrumental hit in the 50s, 60s, and even a bit in the 70s. The 1950s and 60s had more songs in major keys, but since the 1970s, the mix between major and minor key songs has flattened out, as evidenced by the metric mode. Valence, or the mood of the music, has also declined and moved to the range of sadder and angrier music in more recent times versus prior decades. But this is a more bifurcated or split in two distribution, with a big difference before and after 1990. The average tempo of songs is pretty flat over time, but might be slightly faster today than, say, the late 1950s. Duration of songs is another metric that went up substantially, but then decreased in recent times, with popular music of today still longer than that of the late 50s or early 60s. So these two slides provide a written summary of all the things we've discussed over the last several slides for all 12 metrics that we've examined. So, like any good academic, I need to offer some ideas for further research in this area. One would be to extend the database to 1946, the first year for Billboard chart summaries, and include the top 30, 40, or even top 100 songs for each year. We also might pick some songs from representative genres and look at how those differ and how genres have changed over time. Another idea that could be quite extensive is to look at more albums or the whole portfolios of different artists to see where they fall along the spectrum of new versus old school music. And we could try to find some language metrics to see how lyrics have changed over time. One thing I have completely ignored in these first 5 videos is lyrical content, and this could obviously be a big factor in terms of how music has changed. This would be another area that would be ripe for some investigation down the road. So that's it. That concludes our tour of the quantitative measures of popular music and how they have changed over the last 65 years. If you like these videos or if you like my music, be sure to visit andyjasskymusic.com where you can purchase a CD or make a donation to support the videos and the music. I'm also planning to take this information and put it into a book form, and that'll take a while, but be on the lookout for that. If you have any thoughts or ideas about the content or anything else associated with this, please leave them in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube. I'd like to thank everyone very much for watching, and as always, happy listening. Bye-bye.